Alexander Russo barely looked at the blood staining his imported Persian rug. His attention was fixed on the photo glowing on his phone. Beatrice was tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear, while the men holding her clearly believed she was nothing more than an easy target. They thought her size made her weak. They thought kidnapping her would force Alexander to obey. They were wrong on both counts. The Chicago underworld did not run on mercy. It ran on power, money, and fear. Alexander understood that better than anyone. At 32, he had taken control of the Southside Syndicate after years of fighting rivals who never believed he would survive. Now he was close to controlling the Midwest ports, but the old Italian commission in New York still wanted proof that he could be trusted with that kind of power. Their condition was simple. Alexander needed a wife who could make him look stable, respectable, and connected. Beatrice was never supposed to matter beyond that arrangement. She was meant to be useful, quiet, and temporary. But the moment he saw her bound and terrified, Alexander realized the truth. They had not taken his weakness. They had taken the one person he would destroy Chicago to bring home. He needed to be a family man, a settled married man. A wife was a liability in Alexander's eyes, a weakness waiting to be exploited. He didn't want a mob princess who understood the game, nor did he want a frail supermodel who would crumble under the terrifying reality of his life. He needed someone invisible, someone purely transactional. Enter Beatrice Gallagher. Beatrice was 28, a brilliant but overworked forensic accountant who lived entirely outside the violent orbit of the Mafia. She was also drowning. Her younger brother Liam had racked up a staggering $400,000 gambling debt at a high-stakes underground casino run by the Moretti family. The Moretts were impatient, and Liam was given 48 hours before they started breaking bones or worse. Alexander bought the debt. In exchange, he presented Beatrice with an ironclad non-negotiable contract. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of smiling for the cameras at charity galas, attending Sunday dinners, and providing the perfect boring domestic cover for his violent enterprise. At the end of the term, her brother's debt would be forgiven entirely, and she would walk away with $2 million in clean, untraceable funds. When she first walked into Alexander's dimly lit office to sign her life away, she wasn't what anyone expected to stand beside the devil of Chicago. Beatrice was decidedly, unapologetically fat. Where the wives of Alexander's associates were surgically enhanced, hollow-cheeked and starved into size 0 designer dresses, Beatrice was plush and abundant. She had thick thighs, a soft round stomach, and heavy breasts that strained against the modest buttons of her cardigans. She carried her weight with a quiet, stubborn dignity. She didn't shrink away from his terrifying gaze. "You understand the terms, Miss Gallagher?" Alexander had asked, his voice like gravel, his dark eyes raking over her full figure without an ounce of warmth. "I understand you own my brother's life, and now you're renting mine, Mr. Russo," she replied, her voice trembling only slightly. Alexander married her in a private ceremony. 3 days later, for the first 2 months, they lived as ghosts in his sprawling, high-security mansion in Lake Forest. They slept in separate wings. They spoke only when necessary. Alexander treated her like a piece of high-end furniture, valuable for his aesthetic, but entirely ignorable. Beatrice kept to herself, spending her evenings reading in the library, trying to pretend the heavily armed guards pacing the perimeter were just gardeners. But proximity is a dangerous catalyst. It started with small observations. Alexander noticed how Beatrice treated his staff, not with the arrogant dismissal typical of mob wives, but with genuine warmth. She learned the chef's name. She asked the guards about their children. The cold, sterile mansion suddenly smelled like fresh baking on Sundays because Beatrice found the massive commercial kitchen too sad to stay empty. Then came the physical awareness. Alexander was a man of strict discipline, but he found his gaze lingering on the curve of her heavy hips as she walked away from the dining table. He found himself fascinated by the soft swell of her throat, the flushed pink of her cheeks, when she caught him staring. She was entirely real in a world made of plastic and lies. The shift happened at the annual Police Athletic League charity gala, a neutral ground where gangsters and politicians rubbed shoulders. Beatrice was dressed in a custom deep emerald gown that clung to her robust curves. Her dark hair swept up her skin glowing. She was nervous, gripping her champagne flute like a lifeline. Across the ballroom, Carmine, a loud-mouthed lieutenant from a neighboring crew, leaned against the bar with his cronies. He had had too much scotch. "Look at Russo." Carmine sneered, his voice carrying over the string quartet, taking heavy hitter to a whole new level. "Guess he likes his meals supersized. Can't believe the boss is shackled to a whale when he could have anyone." Beatrice froze, the color draining from her face. She lowered her head, an old, familiar shame washing over her. She took a step back, ready to flee to the restrooms. Before she could move, a heavy, warm hand clamped onto the small of her back. "Alexander." He pulled her flush against his side, his grip almost bruising in its possessiveness. He didn't say a word to Beatrice. He simply walked her over to the bar, directly stopping in front of Carmine. The music seemed to fade. The silence around the bar grew suffocating. "Carmine," Alexander said, his voice terrifyingly calm, barely above a whisper. "Hey, Dom," Carmine stammered, suddenly realizing the lethal mistake he had made. The alcohol courage vanished, replaced by stark terror. Just making a joke, boss. No disrespect. My wife is standing right here," Alexander said, his eyes dead and black. "Apologize to her." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Russo. It was a stupid joke." Alexander didn't blink. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, he grabbed Carmine by the back of the neck and slammed his face down onto the marble bar top. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the sudden silence of the room. Blood instantly pooled around scattered cocktail glasses. Alexander pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, calmly wiping a drop of blood from his cuff. He looked at the stunned onlookers. "My wife and I are going home." In the back of the armored Maybach, Beatrice sat trembling, staring out the window at the passing city lights. She felt Alexander slide across the leather seat, closing the distance between them. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "I'm used to it. People look at me and they see a joke. I know I don't fit in your world." Alexander reached out, his rough, calloused fingers gently wiping the tear from her jaw. He leaned in his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "You are my wife," he murmured fiercely. "You wear my name. No one disrespects what is mine. And for the record, Beatrice." His gaze dropped to her lips, then swept over her lush body with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I have exactly what I want." He kissed her then. Not for the cameras, not for the commission. It was a bruising, claiming kiss, full of desperate, suppressed heat. From that night on, the invisible wall between them shattered. Beatrice moved into his bedroom. The fake marriage became terrifyingly real. A deep, consuming obsession that neither was prepared for. Alexander Russo had finally found a weakness, and his enemies were watching. Lorenzo Costello was a vulture wrapped in a $1,000 suit. As the head of the West Side outfit, he had been bleeding territory for months, slowly being choked out by Alexander Russo's aggressive expansion. Costello needed leverage away to force Alexander to the negotiating table and hand over the lucrative trucking unions. Costello had spent weeks having Alexander followed, looking for a mistress, a hidden bank account, a vice. What his scouts brought back made him laugh out loud. Russo, the cold-blooded reaper of the Southside, was playing house. Worse, he wasn't just pretending for the commission anymore. His men reported that Alexander rarely left his wife's side when he was off the clock. "You're telling me?" Costello had wheezed through a cloud of cigar smoke that Russo is head over heels for a fat civilian accountant. That's his weak point. Yes, boss, his informant replied. He's obsessed. She goes to this little bakery in Little Italy every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pasticcia Natalina. He sends one guard with her, a guy named Polly. Tries to keep a low profile so she feels normal. Costello grinned, exposing a row of gold-capped teeth. Normal is about to get very expensive for Mr. Russo. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in October. Beatrice loved pasticceria Natalina. It smelled like vanilla espresso and her old life before armored cars and blood-stained silk. She was laughing with the elderly owner, a white pastry box, tied with red string resting on the counter filled with Alexander's favorite foliate. Poorly, her bodyguard was standing by the glass door watching the street. It happened in less than 10 seconds. A black, unmarked van screeched to a halt onto the sidewalk, shattering the calm of Taylor Street. The side door slid open before the vehicle even fully stopped. 3 men in tactical gear poured out. Polly reached for the Glock under his jacket, but he was too slow. 2 suppressed shots coughed rapidly. Polly went down hard, clutching his shoulder as blood sprayed against the bakery window. Beatrice screamed, dropping the pastry box. Before she could run toward the back exit, massive arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She fought fiercely, kicking, scratching, using every ounce of her heavy frame to throw her attackers off balance. Her elbow connected with a sickening crunch against one man's nose. But there were too many of them. A cloth, soaked in something chemical and pungent, was slammed over her nose and mouth. The world tilted, the smell of vanilla fading into a terrifying dark abyss. 10 miles away, Alexander was sitting at the head of a massive mahogany table in his downtown legitimate corporate office, reviewing zoning permits. His phone buzzed, a private number. He held up a hand, silencing his underboss, Vincent. Alexander pressed the phone to his ear. Russo. Alexander, my friend, my brother. Lorenzo Costello's voice slithered through the speaker. How is the real estate business? Every muscle in Alexander's body instantly turned to granite. Lorenzo, to what do I owe the displeasure? I was just driving through the old neighborhood, Costello sneered. Thought I'd pick up some sweets. Found something real heavy instead. Tell me, Don, do they charge ransoms by the pound these days? Because I've got a whole lot of women sitting in my warehouse right now. Alexander's heart stopped. The world around him seemed to lose all sound and color. What did you say? Alexander's voice was barely a rasp. I have your chubby little fake wife, Russo. Costello laughed, a harsh, grating sound. And let me tell you, she's a handful. Sweating through her clothes, crying. It's pathetic. You really let your standards drop, didn't you? Anyway, here's the deal. You're going to sign over the Teamster locals to me by midnight. If you don't, I let my boys have some fun with the livestock. And then I send her back to you in a few dozen small boxes. Alexander didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He looked down at the pen in his hand. The heavy gold-plated Mont Blanc snapped neatly in half between his fingers, ink bleeding across his knuckles. Lorenzo, Alexander said. A terrifying, absolute calm settling over his words. It was the voice of a dead man walking. If you touch one hair on her head, if you make her cry, I will not just kill you. I will dismantle everything you have ever loved. I will burn your legacy out of the history books. Costello scoffed, trying to mask his sudden unease at the complete lack of panic in Alexander's voice. Midnight Russo. No cops, or the fat girl dies. The line went dead. A moment later, Alexander's phone chimed with a text message. It was a photo. Beatrice tied to a metal chair in a dark room. Her cheek was bruised, her clothes disheveled, but her eyes, looking straight at the camera, were filled with a defiant terror. Alexander slowly stood up from the table. Vincent, his underboss, looked at him, his face draining of color. Vincent had known Alexander for 15 years, but he had never seen the look that currently possessed his boss's face. The calculated businessman was gone. The monster had been unchained. "Cancel the meetings," Alexander said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. "Boss, what happened?" Vincent asked cautiously. Costello took Beatrice. Alexander walked to the wall, pulling aside a framed painting to reveal a hidden biometric safe. He pressed his thumb to the pad, and the heavy steel door swung open, revealing an arsenal of tactical weaponry. He reached in, pulling out a custom Sig Sauer and sliding a magazine home with a loud metallic clack. "Call Victor, call Leo. Get every single man we have off the streets and arm them," Alexander commanded, turning back to Vincent with eyes that burned like hellfire. "Costello thinks he took a pawn. He thinks she's a joke." Alexander shrugged off his tailored suit jacket, letting it drop to the floor, revealing the shoulder holster strapped over his white shirt. "We are going to war," Alexander declared, stalking toward the door. "And we are going to paint this city red until I get my wife back." The smell of rust, stale beer, and damp concrete dragged Beatrice back to consciousness. Her head throbbed with a sickening rhythm, the metallic taste of blood coating her tongue. She blinked against the harsh glare of a single caged industrial bulb swinging from the ceiling. She was sitting in an aluminum chair in the center of a cavernous abandoned warehouse. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back, with thick industrial zip ties that bit painfully into her flesh. Sleeping Beauty wakes. A mocking voice echoed through the damp space. Lorenzo Costello stepped into the pool of light, flanked by 3 heavily armed men wearing tactical vests over cheap suits. Costello was a sharp-featured, wiry man who smelled strongly of cheap cologne and stale tobacco. He circled Beatrice, his dark eyes filled with malicious amusement. "I have to admit, when my boys brought you in, I thought there was a mistake." Costello sneered, stopping in front of her to light a cigarette. "Russo is the most ruthless bastard in the Midwest. He wears bespoke Armani, drives a $500,000 car, and he chooses you. You're a liability. You're slow, you're soft, and frankly, sweetheart, you take up way too much space." Beatrix's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The old familiar sting of humiliation flared in her chest, the lifetime of cruel whispers and sidelong glances about her weight. But as she looked at Costello's sneering face, the shame was suddenly swallowed by a massive, unexpected wave of pure rage. She was Beatrice Gallagher. She had clawed her way out of poverty, earned a master's degree, saved her worthless brother from the mob, and survived the bed of the most terrifying man in Chicago. She was not going to die weeping for a 2-bit gangster. "You made a mistake, Lorenzo," Beatrice said, her voice surprisingly steady. Costello laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Oh, did I? Because right now your husband is signing over the entire Southside shipping lane to me. He's giving up his empire because he's got some twisted fetish for fat girls." "No," Beatrice replied, locking her gaze onto his. "You made a mistake because Alexander isn't going to negotiate. He's going to kill you." Costello's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he raised his hand and struck her across the face. The backhand was brutal, snapping her head to the side. Her lips split against her teeth, warm blood trickling down her chin. "Keep your mouth shut, pig!" Costello spat. He turned to his men. "Watch her. If Russo doesn't confirm the transfer by midnight, shoot her in the knees first. Let her bleed a little." Costello walked away, retreating to an elevated office enclosed by grimy glass overlooking the warehouse floor. 2 guards remained near Beatrice, leaning against a stack of wooden pallets, checking their phones and laughing quietly. Beatrice took a deep, shuddering breath. She tested the zip ties. They were incredibly tight, but they had bound her hands around the thick aluminum backrest of the chair. Because of her broad, heavy shoulders and thick arms, the angle was awkward for the plastic ties. There was tension there. She wasn't a fragile 90-pound socialite who would snap in a breeze. She had power. She had weight. She had leverage. Suddenly, the warehouse plunged into absolute darkness. The main power breaker had been violently severed. The only light came from the pale moonlight filtering through the high, shattered skylights. "What the hell?" One of the guards muttered, the sound of a rifle safety clicking off, echoing in the dark. "Check the generator." They never got the chance. The reinforced steel loading doors at the front of the warehouse didn't just open, they completely detonated. A breaching charge ripped the heavy metal from its hinges in a deafening roar of fire and smoke. The shockwave rattled Beatrix's bones. Through the billowing grey smoke, a nightmare stepped into the warehouse. Alexander Russo didn't come with an army. He came as a god of war, flanked by Vincent and 4 heavily armored syndicate enforcers wielding Heckler and MP5 submachine guns. Alexander moved with terrifying lethal precision. He wore black tactical gear over his dress shirt, an unsuppressed Sig Sauer in each hand. The warehouse erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire. The muzzle flashes strobe lit the darkness, revealing the slaughter. Alexander's men moved like a highly trained paramilitary unit, dropping Costello's guards before they could even aim their weapons. The 2 guards near Beatrice panicked. One raised his rifle toward the smoke, firing blindly. The other, realizing the target value of the woman in the chair, lunged toward Beatrice with a combat knife drawn. Now Beatrice didn't wait to be rescued. As the guard lunged, she used her heavily built thighs to push backward with all her might. The aluminum chair tipped. She threw her entire body weight sideways, twisting her thick wrists violently against the strained plastic. The zip tie snapped with a sharp crack. Beatrice hit the concrete floor hard, but the guard tripped over the falling chair. Before he could recover, Beatrice rolled, throwing her full heavy weight directly onto the man's extended arm. The sickening sound of his elbow snapping backward was masked by the gunfire. He screamed, dropping the knife. Beatrice scrambled away, pressing her back against the cold steel of a structural pillar. The gunfire abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was heavier, completely suffocating. "Lorenzo." Alexander's voice BM'd through the warehouse. It was devoid of humanity. It was the voice of the Reaper. "Come out and die." Costello was trapped in the elevated glass office. He had watched in paralyzed horror as Alexander dismantled his crew in less than 60 seconds. Panicking, Lorenzo grabbed a heavy revolver from his desk, kicked the office door open, and stumbled onto the metal catwalk overlooking the floor. "Russo, back off!" Costello screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror. He aimed the revolver down at the shadows, desperately searching for Beatrice. "I'll kill her. I swear to God, I'll put a bullet in her brain." A spotlight rigged by Vincent on the ground suddenly blinded Costello. Crack! Alexander fired a single shot from the floor. The bullet shattered Costello's kneecap. Lorenzo shrieked, collapsing onto the grating of the catwalk, the revolver slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor below. Alexander walked out of the shadows. His face was splattered with the blood of Costello's men, his chest heaving slightly. His dark, dead eyes scanned the room until they found Beatrice huddled behind the pillar. When Alexander saw her split lip and the blood staining her blouse, the temperature in the room seemed to drop below freezing. He didn't run to her. He walked up the metal stairs to the catwalk, his footsteps slow, heavy, and deliberate. Each ring of his boots on the metal sounded like a tolling bell. Costello was sobbing, dragging himself backward, trailing blood across the grating. "Dom, please," Costello begged, holding up shaking, bloody hands. "It was business, just business. You can keep the ports. You can have the west side. Just let me walk." Alexander stopped, towering over the broken man. "You called her a liability," Alexander whispered, pulling a sleek black stiletto from his vest. "You laid your horns on my wife. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "Apologize to her," Alexander commanded, dragging Costello by his collar to the edge of the catwalk. So he looked down at Beatrice louder. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Russo. Please." Alexander leaned down his lips, brushing Costello's ear. "She accepts." With a brutal, fluid motion, Alexander drove the stiletto up under Costello's ribs, piercing his heart. He held the man there, watching the life drain from Lorenzo's terrified eyes, before casually letting the body drop to the metal floor. Alexander wiped the blade on Costello's jacket, sheathed it, and descended the stairs. Vincent and the enforcers had already secured the perimeter, standing guard at the shattered entrance, giving their boss privacy. Alexander holstered his weapons and fell to his knees in front of Beatrice. The cold, ruthless monster vanished, replaced by a man completely unraveled by fear. His large, blood-stained hands hovered over her, afraid to touch her, afraid she would break. Beatrice. He choked out his voice, rough with emotion. She didn't shrink away from the blood on him. She reached out her soft, thick arms wrapping around his neck, pulling his face into the crook of her shoulder. Alexander let out a jagged breath, burying his face in her hair, his massive arms wrapping around her waist, crushing her plush body against his armored chest, as if trying to merge their souls. "I'm okay," she whispered, her hands stroking his dark hair. "I got the ties off. I'm okay." Alexander pulled back slightly, framing her face in his hands. His thumbs gently traced her bruised cheek, avoiding her split lip. His eyes roved over her, taking in her solid, unyielding strength. "They thought you were weak," Alexander said fiercely, his eyes shining in the dim light. "They thought because you're soft, you would break. You are the strongest thing in my world, Beatrice. You are magnificent." He kissed her deeply, tasting her blood and his tears. 2 hours later, they were back in the sprawling Lake Forest mansion. A private underworld doctor had already cleaned Beatrix's cuts and wrapped her bruised wrists. She was sitting in the center of Alexander's massive leather bed, wearing one of his oversized dress shirts, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. Alexander walked into the bedroom. He had showered, scrubbing the blood from his skin, dressed only in a pair of gray sweatpants. In his hand, he held a thick manila folder. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. It was the marriage contract, the 3-year deal, the $2 million payout. Without a word, Alexander picked up a gold lighter from the bedside table. He flicked it open, touched the flame to the corner of the heavy parchment, and dropped it into a heavy crystal ashtray. Beatrice watched the paper curl and blackened the flames, illuminating the dark intensity in Alexander's eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. "Renegotiating the terms," Alexander said, looking up at her. He shifted closer, pulling the mug from her hands and setting it aside. He pressed his palms flat against her thick thighs, a gesture of absolute worship. "The fake marriage is over. The debt is gone. You are free to walk out that door, Beatrice, with the money, with a new identity. I will give you the world, and I will never let the darkness touch you again." Beatrice looked at the smoldering ashes of the contract. "And if I don't want to walk out?" Alexander's chest hitched. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. "Then you stay. But you stay as my equal, my queen. No end dates, no exit clauses. I want all of you, Beatrice. Every beautiful, perfect inch of you, until the day I die." Beatrix smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her expressive eyes. She tangled her fingers in the gold chain, resting against his bare chest, pulling him down onto the mattress. "Then, I guess we better start planning a real honeymoon," she whispered against his lips. The Devil of Chicago had finally been captured, and he happily handed over the keys to his cage. 1 year later, the annual Police Athletic League charity gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel. The room quieted as the double doors swung open. Alexander Russo walked in, the undisputed, unchallenged king of the Midwest, his presence commanding absolute silence. But all eyes were drawn to the woman on his arm. Beatrice Russo was breathtaking. She wore a custom crimson silk gown that hugged her lush, heavy curves perfectly, the fabric draping elegantly over the distinct swelling bump of her 7-month pregnancy. Beatrice walked into the room, with her head high, no longer trying to hide from anyone's judgment. The same people who once whispered about Alexander's wife now fell silent when she passed. They had laughed at her body, questioned her place beside him, and treated her like someone easy to dismiss. Tonight, they understood their mistake. She was not there because Alexander had chosen a weak woman to stand beside him. She was there because she had survived fear, humiliation, and danger without breaking. Alexander stood at her side, cold and calm, but everyone in the room knew what he had done for her. They knew what would happen to anyone foolish enough to touch her again. Beatrice was no longer a joke in the Chicago underworld. She was power. She was loyalty. She was the woman who brought Alexander Russo's enemies to their knees without ever needing to beg for respect. Did Beatrice's rise surprise you, or was Alexander right to destroy everyone who hurt her? Tell us in the comments. If you enjoyed this Mafia romance filled with danger, loyalty, revenge, and a powerful curvy heroine, like, share, and subscribe for more dark romance stories.